Iran already has the material for more than 200 nuclear bombs. Not in centrifuges, not in the underground bunkers at Fordow that the world has been watching for 20 years, sitting quietly in a spent fuel pond at a reactor on the Persian Gulf coast, a reactor the international inspectors have not visited since August of last year, a reactor that Israel has bombed twice and that Iran has tried to rebuild both times. Right now, the Trump administration is negotiating what could be the most consequential nuclear deal in a generation. And the people who built those deals, who inspected those facilities, who spent careers counting warheads, they are sounding an alarm. The question is whether anyone in the room is listening. Welcome. What you are about to hear in the next 25 minutes is a story unfolding right now, today. And most of the major news networks are not covering the most dangerous part of it. The world's attention is fixed on Iran's uranium enrichment program, the centrifuges, the 60% enriched stockpile, the underground facilities. And yes, those are real threats. But nuclear weapons experts, including a former Pentagon official and a former United Nations weapons inspector, are warning that there is a second pathway to an Iranian nuclear bomb, one built not on uranium, but on plutonium, one that is not currently at the center of U.S. Iran negotiations, one that could let Tehran walk through a diplomatic back door while the world watches the front gate. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what the plutonium pathway is and why it matters. You will know why the last time international inspectors visited Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant was nearly 9 months ago, and what that gap means. And you will know what experts are demanding the Trump administration include in any new deal, and what happens to the entire Middle East if they don't. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. Now, let's get into it. The article was published on May 8, 2026, by Fox News correspondent Benjamin Weinthal, a reporter who covers Iran, Israel, and nuclear proliferation for the network. The story is built on direct statements from 4 of the most credentialed voices in nonproliferation policy in the United States. The trigger for this alarm is the ongoing U.S. Iran nuclear negotiation framework, which the Trump administration has been pursuing with varying intensity since early 2025. Those talks have centered overwhelmingly on Iran's uranium enrichment program, the cascade of centrifuges spinning at Natanz and Fordow, the stockpile of highly enriched uranium that has grown dramatically since the U.S. withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. But here is what the experts are saying. While everyone is watching uranium, Iran has a second route to a nuclear weapon. That route runs through plutonium, and the infrastructure for it is sitting at a reactor on Iran's southern coast, a reactor that Russia built, that Russia operates, and that Israel has already bombed twice in the last 12 months. The core demand is simple. Any deal Trump signs must include a permanent, verified ban on Iran extracting and reprocessing the spent nuclear fuel at Bushehr. It must include near real-time international monitoring of that facility, and it must address the Iraq heavy water reactor, which Iran has been trying to rebuild even after Israeli airstrikes reduced it to rubble, twice. If those requirements are not in the deal, the experts say the agreement is not a deal. It is a trap. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back, not just to the 2015 JCPOA, but further, to the beginning. Iran's nuclear program was launched in the 1950s with direct American assistance under the Atoms for Peace initiative. The Shah wanted civilian nuclear power, and Washington was happy to help. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the clerical regime inherited that infrastructure, and over the following decades, quietly began converting it toward weapons capability. The world got its first major shock in August 2002, when an Iranian opposition group publicly revealed the existence of 2 secret nuclear facilities: the uranium enrichment plant at Natanz and the heavy water production facility at Iraq. The Iraq plant was significant because heavy water reactors produce plutonium as a byproduct. That is not an accident. It is by design. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, attempted to address both pathways. On uranium, it imposed strict limits on enrichment levels and stockpile sizes. On plutonium, it required Iran to redesign the Iraq reactor so it could not produce weapons-grade material, and to fill the core of the original reactor with concrete. Iran agreed, but it retained the Bushehr reactor, a fully operational Russian-built plant on the Persian Gulf, and it retained all of its plutonium knowledge. When President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA in 2018, Iran began systematically rolling back every commitment it had made. Enrichment levels climbed, stockpiles grew, and the Iraq site, supposedly neutered, became a subject of renewed intelligence concern. Then, in June 2025, Israel struck the Iraq heavy water facility. Significant damage. Iran began rebuilding. In March 2026, Israel struck it again, and according to Policy Director Jason Brodsky of United Against Nuclear Iran, intelligence indicated Iran was attempting to reconstruct the facility even after the second bombing. That pattern, bomb, rebuild, bomb again, tells you something critical about Tehran's intentions. They are not building these facilities for electricity. But here is what almost nobody is talking about. The Iraq reactor is not the only plutonium risk. There is a second facility, one that has never been bombed, one that is fully operational right now, and one where the inspectors have not been since August of last year. And what Iran could do with what is sitting inside it is the part of this story that keeps the experts up at night. Let's talk about who is at the center of this story, because understanding the players is how you understand the stakes. First, Henry Sokolski. He is the executive director of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center and served as deputy for nonproliferation policy in the U.S. Department of Defense under President George H.W. Bush. This is not a commentator. This is someone who built U.S. nuclear policy from the inside. He published a piece in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in April, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world on nuclear issues, arguing that Iran has accumulated enough plutonium at Bushehr for more than 200 nuclear weapons. He is calling on the Trump administration to require near real-time surveillance of Bushehr and a specific ban on removing spent fuel from the site. Second, Jason Brodsky, policy director at United Against Nuclear Iran, a bipartisan advocacy organization. He is pointing specifically to the rebuilt Iraq reactor and insisting that any deal must address the plutonium pathway explicitly, not just uranium. Third, Andrea Stricker of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She is calling for a permanent, verified ban on plutonium reprocessing as a non-negotiable condition of any agreement. She also points to an important nuance. Moscow required Iran to permit inspectors back into Bushehr after the June 2025 Israeli strikes, and those inspections resumed in August 2025. Russia has a financial and strategic interest in Bushehr not being diverted. Diversion would give Russia grounds to cut off enriched uranium fuel supplies, collapsing a multi-billion-dollar investment and plunging southern Iran into energy crisis. Fourth, David Albright, former United Nations weapons inspector, president of the Institute for Science and International Security, and notably, the skeptic in the room. Albright argues the plutonium risk from Bushehr is technically overstated. He points out that reactor-grade plutonium, the kind produced at Bushehr, is not the ideal material for a bomb, that Iran has no known design for a plutonium-based weapon, and that any diversion would almost certainly be detected and trigger a Russian cutoff. He calls it a remote possibility. Then there is the Trump administration itself, A State Department spokesperson confirmed to Fox News that Iran is in breach of its nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations and called for serious diplomatic negotiations. That is a statement of position. It is not yet a detailed requirement list. And finally, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian, who visited nuclear facilities in Tehran in November 2025, and the Supreme Leader Khamenei, who has approved every escalation of the nuclear program. Iran's regime sees its nuclear capability as the ultimate guarantee of survival. They watched what happened to Libya's Muammar Gaddafi after he gave up his weapons program. They are not likely to accept permanent, intrusive monitoring without extracting something significant in return. What is actually happening on the ground right now? Start with Bushehr. The nuclear power plant on Iran's Persian Gulf coast is Russia's project. Built by Rosatom, operated with Russian technical assistance, fueled with Russian-supplied enriched uranium. It provides electricity to the surrounding region. For ordinary Iranians living near Bushehr, the plant is both a source of power and a source of anxiety. Every escalation in the nuclear standoff risks making their city a target. The last time IAEA inspectors walked through the Bushehr facility was August 27, 2025. That is the date the article cites directly. Think about what that means. In the 9 months since that visit, the world has been watching Iran's uranium program through remote monitoring and satellite imagery, but nobody has physically inspected the spent fuel pond at Bushehr. Nobody has verified with eyes-on access what is or is not being moved. At Arak, the heavy water reactor that Israel struck twice, the situation is more overtly militarized. The site is in ruins, but Iranian engineers have reportedly returned to assess and begin reconstruction. The area is under satellite surveillance. IDF infographics released in 2026 describe Arak as key infrastructure for plutonium production. Israeli intelligence services have it in their target list. And yet, Iran rebuilds. For the Iranian people, the nuclear standoff is not an abstraction. It is crippling sanctions, currency collapse, fuel shortages, and the ever-present awareness that their government is playing a game with consequences that would fall on civilian heads. Iran's regime carries out near daily executions for domestic dissent. The population has no vote on how far the nuclear gamble goes. Meanwhile, across the border in Israel, every new revelation about Iran's nuclear progress tightens the pressure on the government to act. Israel has already acted, twice at Arak and with broader strikes during the 2025 conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's position has been consistent and public. No Iranian nuclear weapon, by any pathway, under any circumstances. But here is the part no one is talking about, and it changes everything. President Obama was specifically asked by the IAEA to demand real-time monitoring of the Bushehr reactor during the 2015 deal negotiations. Iran said no, and Obama did not push back. That decision, made a decade ago in a closed room between diplomats who thought they had the bigger issue solved, may now be the single most consequential gap in the entire framework for stopping Iran's nuclear program. Subscribe now if you're finding this valuable. We are just getting to the most important part. The international reaction to Iran's nuclear program in 2026 is a mosaic of self-interest, fear, and diplomatic paralysis. The United States under President Trump has taken a maximalist public position, maximum economic pressure, the threat of military force, and a demand for a deal that goes further than the 2015 JCPOA. Trump has described Iran as financially collapsing, starving for cash, and desperate for relief. Whether that assessment is accurate or whether it is a negotiating posture remains contested. Russia is playing a double game. Moscow built Bushehr, operates it, supplies its fuel, and profits from the arrangement. Russia demanded Iran allow inspectors back in after the June 2025 strikes. That is a rare instance of Russia acting as a responsible non-proliferation actor. But Russia also has every incentive to keep Iran as a geopolitical client, which means it is simultaneously acting as a restraint on Iran's nuclear ambitions and a shield against tougher international action. China has been quietly purchasing Iranian oil in defiance of U.S. sanctions, providing Tehran with economic oxygen. Beijing has consistently opposed military action against Iran and has used its UN Security Council position to water down or delay punitive resolutions. European nations, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, remain committed to a diplomatic track and have been working through the JCPOA mechanism even after the U.S. withdrawal. They are alarmed by the current trajectory, but lack the military leverage to enforce any outcome. Israel's position is the clearest: 2 airstrikes on Iraq in 12 months, persistent intelligence operations inside Iran, and a public commitment from the government that it will not allow Iran to achieve nuclear weapons capability. Full stop. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has been explicit. If Iran gets a bomb, Riyadh will pursue one too. The Turkish government has made similar noises. The domino logic of nuclear proliferation in the region is not hypothetical. It is a declared intention. The IAEA, the supposed watchdog, has been neutered by reduced access. Recent IAEA reports, according to the experts cited in this article, have not addressed the plutonium pathway with any specificity. That silence is its own kind of alarm. Here is the real story beneath the story, and it is one that has been hiding in plain sight for a decade. During the negotiations that produced the 2015 JCPOA, the IAEA specifically asked the Obama administration to insist on near real-time monitoring of the Bushehr reactor and its spent fuel pond. This was not a theoretical concern. The International Atomic Agency's own inspectors understood that every 90-day inspection cycle left enormous windows during which spent fuel could theoretically be moved without detection. Iran said no to the monitoring request, and the Obama administration did not fight for it. They prioritized getting Iran to the table on uranium enrichment, the more visible, more politically legible threat, and allowed the plutonium surveillance question to be quietly shelved. Henry Sokolski has been making this argument publicly, now in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the journal that sets the doomsday clock. He is not a fringe voice. He is a former Pentagon official who served under a Republican president, writing in the most respected nuclear policy publication in the world, arguing that a specific, deliberate decision during the Obama era left a hole in every subsequent nuclear framework. The mainstream coverage of current U.S. Iran talks focuses almost entirely on uranium enrichment percentages and centrifuge counts. The plutonium question is treated as secondary. But consider this: you can bomb enrichment facilities. You can set back a uranium program by years with airstrikes. Plutonium that has already been produced, sitting in a spent fuel pond right now, cannot be unproduced. The material already exists. The question is only whether Iran can get to it, extract it, and weaponize it before the world notices. That is not a future risk. That is a present condition, and the deal being negotiated right now either addresses it or it doesn't. We told you at the start of this video that there was a question hanging over these negotiations, a question that the world's best non-proliferation experts are demanding gets answered before any deal is signed. Here it is again, sharper now. Can the Trump administration negotiate a deal that closes the uranium pathway and the plutonium pathway simultaneously? Or will Iran do what it has done before? Give up the thing you're watching and keep the thing you're not. Stay with us, because the stakes section of this story is where this gets truly alarming. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. This is exactly the kind of reporting you won't find condensed anywhere else. Let's be direct about what failure looks like. If the Trump administration signs a nuclear deal that constrains Iran's uranium enrichment but leaves the plutonium pathway open, either by omitting a ban on reprocessing or by allowing inadequate inspection access to Bushehr, then the deal is not a non-proliferation agreement. It is a delay mechanism with a specific expiration date. Iran's regime has demonstrated one thing consistently over the past 40 years. It treats every agreement as a phase, not a destination. It accepts limits when under maximum pressure, then expands when pressure eases. That is not speculation. That is the documented history of Iran's nuclear behavior from 2003 to 2026. The worst-case scenario? Iran uses the cover of a deal to secure economic relief, rebuild its finances, let the inspection regime relax, and quietly accumulate enough reprocessed plutonium to construct a device. The timeline for this, according to experts, is not decades. Given the existing stockpile at Bushehr and a functioning reprocessing capability, it could be measured in months. A nuclear-armed Iran does not just threaten Israel. It collapses the entire post-World War II non-proliferation architecture. Saudi Arabia has said it will respond in kind. Turkey has signaled the same. The Middle East, already the world's most volatile region, becomes a multi-nuclear state arena. The likely case? Negotiations continue in a prolonged cycle. Iran extracts economic concessions in exchange for partial compliance on uranium. The plutonium question remains unresolved or poorly monitored. Israel, watching this, prepares for a unilateral military option. At some point, triggered by a specific intelligence report or a red line being crossed, Israel acts. The region enters a new conflict cycle. Oil prices spike. Global markets shudder. The best case: the Trump administration, informed by the warnings of Sokolski, Brodsky, Stricker, and others, insists on a comprehensive deal that addresses both pathways. Iran, under the combined pressure of maximum economic sanctions, an active Israeli military threat, and Russian pressure to comply, accepts the terms. Near real-time monitoring of Bushehr is established. A permanent reprocessing ban is codified. The Iraq site is rendered permanently inoperable under international verification. It is possible. It has just never been done. Let's summarize where the serious minds stand. Henry Sokolski of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center is the loudest alarm bell. His position? Iran has more than enough plutonium at Bushehr for a massive number of nuclear devices. The IAEA inspection regime at that site has been inadequate for years. Visits every 90 days at best, nothing since August 2025. Any deal must include near real-time surveillance of the Bushehr reactor and a binding prohibition on removing spent fuel. He has been making this argument since the Obama era. The question is whether the Trump administration hears it differently this time. Jason Brodsky of United Against Nuclear Iran agrees that the deal must explicitly address the plutonium pathway. He points to Iran's behavior at Iraq as evidence of intent. A site bombed twice that Iran keeps trying to rebuild is not a civilian energy project. It is a weapons development program wearing civilian clothes. Andrea Stricker of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies calls for a permanent, verified ban on plutonium reprocessing as a firm condition. She also notes a nuance that is easy to miss. The plutonium at Bushehr is reactor grade, not weapons grade. Using it to build a functional, high-yield weapon is technically challenging. That does not mean impossible. That means difficult. And Iran has a track record of solving difficult technical problems in secret over time when it believes the world is looking elsewhere. David Albright, who has inspected more nuclear facilities than almost anyone alive, is the measured skeptic. He does not dismiss the concern entirely. He says it is a remote possibility. He points to the lack of a known Iranian plutonium bomb design, the quality issues with reactor-grade material, and the Russian tripwire of fuel supply cutoff as genuine constraints. But he does not say, ignore it. He says, it is less likely than the uranium pathway. That is not an argument for leaving it out of a deal. Remember the question we opened with. Iran has the material for over 200 nuclear bombs sitting in a facility that hasn't been inspected in 9 months. The deal being negotiated right now may not require anyone to go back in. And the decision to leave that gap open was made once before, in 2015. And the man who made it was never held accountable for it. Here is what we now know. The same gap is open again. And this time, the stakes are higher. 3 scenarios, grounded in what we know today. Best case, the Trump administration, briefed by nonproliferation experts, including Sokolski, incorporates explicit plutonium reprocessing prohibitions and near real-time Bushehr monitoring requirements into any final agreement. Iran, facing economic collapse and isolated from both Western and some Russian support, accepts the terms. The IAEA reestablishes a robust inspection presence at Bushehr within weeks of any deal signing. The Iraq site is subject to permanent decommissioning verification. This is not fantasy. This is what a serious deal looks like. Whether the political will exists on both sides is the open question. Likely case. A partial deal is reached that addresses uranium enrichment metrics, centrifuge counts, enrichment ceilings, stockpile limits, and provides Iran with significant sanctions relief. The plutonium question is handled with vague language about additional monitoring and future discussions. Iran accepts this, knowing the vagueness is exploitable. The deal is announced as a breakthrough. Critics warn it is incomplete. Iran begins rebuilding its economy and its nuclear options simultaneously. Israel watches, calculates, and prepares. The next crisis is not prevented. It is delayed by 2 to 4 years and made more dangerous by the economic recovery Tehran uses that time to achieve. Worst case, no deal is reached. Economic pressure continues. Iran's regime, facing domestic instability and international isolation, makes a calculated decision to weaponize what it has before the window closes. Intelligence agencies detect activity at Bushehr or at a covert reprocessing site. Israel launches a preemptive strike. Iran responds with missile attacks on Israeli territory, activates proxies in Lebanon and Iraq, and threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz. The United States is drawn into a regional conflict it sought to avoid. Oil prices reach historic levels. Global supply chains fracture. And the Middle East enters the most dangerous phase of its modern history. Here is what we want to hear from you. The experts in this story are divided. David Albright, a man who has physically stood inside nuclear facilities and counted warheads, says the plutonium risk from Bushehr is overstated. Henry Sokolski, a man who wrote the Nonproliferation Policy for a U.S. president, says it is the most underappreciated danger in the current negotiations. Who do you believe and why? Here is the second question, and it is the one that will tell us something about how you see diplomacy itself. Given Iran's documented history of complying with deals under pressure and then systematically reversing those commitments when pressure eases, is any deal, no matter how carefully constructed, actually capable of solving this problem? Or does Iran's behavior over the past 40 years suggest that the regime will never voluntarily give up its nuclear ambitions, and that only a fundamental change in the nature of the Iranian government can end this crisis for good? Tell us what you think in the comments. This community has some of the most informed viewers on any news channel on this platform, and this conversation deserves serious voices. Here are the 3 things you need to remember from everything you've just heard. 1, Iran's plutonium stockpile is real, it is large, and it is sitting in a facility that international inspectors have not physically visited since August 2025. That is not a future problem. That is a present condition. 2, The Trump administration's nuclear negotiations with Iran have focused almost entirely on the uranium pathway. Multiple credentialed experts, including a former Pentagon official and a former UN weapons inspector, are publicly demanding that any deal also include a permanent, verified ban on plutonium reprocessing and real-time monitoring of the Bushehr reactor. Whether that demand gets incorporated into a final framework is the single most important unanswered question in these negotiations. 3, we have been here before. In 2015, the same gap existed. The same request was made by the IAEA, and the same gap was left open. The consequences of that decision are still unfolding. Watch for these developments in the coming days and weeks. Watch whether the State Department's public position shifts to include specific plutonium language. Watch whether Iran's response to the current U.S. framework acknowledges the Bushehr monitoring question at all. And watch Israel, because Israel's actions are the most reliable real-time indicator of what its intelligence services believe Iran is actually doing. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next negotiating session, potentially within the next 72 hours, could define whether the most dangerous nuclear standoff of this generation ends with a real agreement or a paper one. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be here first. The world is not watching the right door, and the people who know it are running out of time to make someone listen.